So much, Chris. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. And I just want to make sure that you're seeing are you seeing a World Refugee Day poster? Glad that that's up there. It's really a pleasure to be part of this. And to Chris's point, I am going to look at the global, the Canadian, and the local today. I'm a geographer by training here at York University. So let's start ever so briefly with a global view of displacement. We've heard some of the numbers from both Yusuf and Chris, and they are staggering. I think as much as we know we have more than 26 million refugees, we also have to remember that many people live in refugee-like conditions and they don't qualify, or they might not meet the exact definition for reasons Yusuf pointed out. It could be drought, it could be famine, there could be environmental crises, even a hurricane that displaces someone. But there are a lot of people missing from these numbers as well. But one number I would like to leave you with, or at least introduce, is the idea that more than 85% of refugees in the world live in global south locations. That might include the Middle East, as we sometimes call it, perhaps geographically in error, but places where they're close to their countries of origin, but still displaced in countries that are not always, with all that many resources to spare, let's say. So I want to bring that into view because we often think of refugees in the Canadian context, and not everyone can come, as Chris pointed out. The pattern of extended exile is another number I want to dwell on for just a moment, because we think of displacement as an event in a sense. Maybe it happens, lasts for a couple of months, a couple of years, but in fact, the average number of years a person holds refugee status in the world is currently 20 years. So that is almost a generation of potential displacement. Now that is an average. We know that, I can say from my own experience, the first refugee camp I ever went into was the Dadaab complex. The first camp built was IFO, and I got to volunteer for a faith organization while in Kenya to help construct a feeding center for children. But since that time, and as a professor, I've asked my students, how can a temporary stopgap measure that was only supposed to be brief, how can that camp still be there 29 years later? So I want to just really reinforce the protracted nature that Chris alluded to. From a Canadian perspective, I'm going to touch on this very briefly in my remaining 4.5 minutes. And then I want to touch on, and I look forward to learning hugely from the other panelists on this and the subsequent panels. What can we do through our faith communities, through our fundraising efforts, in daily encounters, whether through our work or through our role as just civil society? So ever so briefly, sorry, play from current slide, sorry about that. The UNHCR has called the last decade of displacement. More than 100 million people have been displaced. And to points made earlier, only a fraction have found a solution, which is UNHCR's terminology for these durable solutions Chris was speaking about. So that's less than 4%. So this underscores that protracted nature that I was just referring to. And these lives on hold are an invisible, largely invisible, but very important issue for us to kind of wrap our heads around and our hearts around. Moving to the Canadian context, and again, I'm moving ever so quickly here, we have had some good news in the last couple of days from Immigration Minister Mendicino, who's announced some increases. But I just want to say that we've seen some good shifts overall. If you're not familiar with these acronyms, let me quickly run through them. The GAR is the Government Assisted Refugee. And in 2010, that number, which has been the same since the 1990s, 7,500, has moved up to 10,100 in 2020. Chris was just briefing me before this call that we are looking at approximately 13,000 in the next few years. So we're going to see a sizable increase there. PSR is privately sponsored refugees. Again, in 2010, about 4,500, even a little bit less, moving up considerably, more than fourfold increase. And that number has increased again in 2021. It's set to increase a little bit more, but not as dramatically as it has. And then the BVOR category, we won't get into the details of what that stands for, except to say that it's a blended version of the GAR and the PSR. It's a category introduced in 2013, so we don't have all that much data on it. But certainly increases in protection spaces should be applauded. I want to mention that because this government has done a lot to expand the protection space, especially for people who are in those protracted situations. But a challenge that we might be able to still put out there: can the Canadian government ensure support for the same number of GARs, government assisted, as PSRs? We know that PSRs are private citizens, permanent residents who put their money in and support refugees for a year. Can we increase and match with government money the numbers there? So that's one challenge for government. Moving quickly to local, and again, very brief presentation, so pardon the speed at which things are going. But I wanted to introduce research assistants on a team that I'm working on that's looking at why sponsors in Canada continue, and faith communities, of course, are leaders in this effort, continue to support and sponsor refugees year after year after year. For 40 years, more than 325,000 refugees and their families have come to Canada. And what we found, what we were told by more than 100 people who came formerly as sponsored refugees, or who are long-term seasoned sponsors, we might call them, is that sponsorship is a community practice. It's a way of locally enacting global social justice, connecting the local and the global through bringing a refugee family or person to Canada from a camp, from a war zone, from a place where human rights atrocities prevail. So what can we do? Just to wrap up here, we can lobby our governments for stronger refugee resettlement commitments. We can applaud them for what they have done. And I think many of us, and we're going to hear many more precise, detailed, day-to-day efforts that are happening, but funding faith-based and other organizations supporting refugees abroad, those who are invisible in those protracted refugee situations. They need our attention and our help. But we also need to unsettle ourselves and to reach out to newcomers, not just refugees, but immigrants, maybe people that we've just never spoken to, people who may be new in our community, on a daily basis. I think to create stronger communities that can combat racism and Islamophobia, we need to do more. And in the wake of the London tragedy earlier this month, I hope we will do more. Finally, to Mary's point earlier, we need to recognize the displacement of Indigenous peoples as colonial and contemporary violence, and to make change with them on the lands they share with us. So thanks so much to everyone for your attention, and I look forward to the other panelists.